Hello, Kristen Knudsen, Production Manager and Technical Director at the College Light Opera Company, coming to you from the Highfield Theater, or the basement of the Highfield Theater. Behind the Scenes with Kristen Knudsen is made possible by a generous gift from Clyde Tyndale and Deb Winograd. Last week we wrapped up our exploration of theatrical lighting. This week I'm in the paint area because I want to talk about the art of scenic painting, or at least a very small portion of it, because there's a lot of ways to paint scenery and we don't have a lot of time in this episode. So I'm going to demonstrate a couple of faux finishes that if you had the materials at home, you could certainly try along with me. The paint process detailed in this episode is presented chronologically rather than by item, to reflect the reality of working up multiple samples at once and accommodating dry time. The summer is rapidly nearing its end, and my to-do list here at Clock is still a mile long. One way or another, I needed to sort through the paint area at the Highfield Theater, and rather than digging through cans of mystery paint hoping for a few useful colors for this episode, I decided to take the time to check absolutely every bucket of paint and sort our current stock by color and sheen. Paint does go bad if not closed up properly, so I weeded out all the rotten and dried up paint, and I made sure every usable can has a current sample of color on the lid. Most of what I found was labeled for last year's productions of Mary Poppins and Bye Bye Birdie. Now that the paint area is organized and I know what we have to work with, I'm going to demonstrate a couple faux finishing techniques for you. I'm going to limit myself to a few varieties of wood grain and a couple different concrete, plaster, stone looks for you. I wanted to do a marble, and you might see some beginnings of a marble in the background of these shots. I simply ran out of time. As with all these videos, I do not profess to be an expert at scenic painting. I certainly have more experience in that area than I do with electrics. I do have a visual arts background. Just keep in mind that these demonstrations are by no means the only way or best way to achieve these faux finishes. I'm simply working with what I have on hand, as if I were a student dropped into this scenario where I'm here at Clock, this is what I've got to work with, you got to make wood grain, do it now. This is how I would try to do it. So the only materials that I purchased for this project, beyond what was available here at the Highfield already, I bought a couple of quarts of some polyurethane sealer of different sheens, and I bought a new roll of painter's tape, and I bought some Masonite project boards to paint on. So everything else I found here in the theater and made use of what was available. I've prepared some 2-foot by 2-foot sample boards out of Masonite. I'm going to use some painter's tape to divide these up into regions so I can demonstrate different methods for the same sort of effect. For the purpose of this demonstration, I'm going to use regular old lightweight spackling compound as my texture medium. So I'm going to start by getting the texture on so it has time to dry while I mix colors and get paint ready to go. This board is going to be our concrete or stone effect. So I'm going to take this spackling putty, and it's brand new, so it's still nice and liquidy, which is perfect for this. And I'm going to apply it with the brush in a stippling pattern, kind of causing it to have little high peaks. And I'm going to let it dry that way so it has sort of the same texture as concrete would. I might also try dragging through it so that it looks like concrete that's been smoothed over. We'll take a look here and see. But we're going to try that out in this region right here. And the color doesn't matter. And it's important to know this stuff is going to shrink when it dries. So if I'm aiming for concrete, it does want to be a relatively even pattern here. And you can see I'm turning my brush frequently so that I don't end up with sort of a line repeating over and over again. I'm trying to make certain there's no obvious pattern. And I'm just gently tapping, and I get a little bit more on the brush whenever it feels like I'm not getting peaks anymore. And it's okay in this instance if you don't cover every single bit of the masonite, as long as whatever you're doing is even. So if you've got gaps, just make certain that those gaps are evenly happening. And the whole purpose of this painter's tape is so I can just paint right up and be messy and go right up over the edge with my treatment. And as long as I peel this tape before things set, I'm gonna have a nice clean edge. Now, if this were gonna be used as an actual floor, I probably wouldn't be using this spackling putty because this is a pretty easily crushed, easily flaked material. You'd probably wanna use something heavier duty if it's gonna be underfoot. There are a lot of different products that do the same thing here. Some are flexible, some are harder, you can sand them. Me, I was going for cheap and easy, so that's what we've got today. Anytime that I notice sort of like a directional pattern happening, I go back and I try to break it up a little bit. It's obviously go a lot faster with a bigger brush. It's also pretty easy to do this with a roller. If you get the texture of the texture of just the right consistency, you can roll it on and then come back with the brush and maybe just hit a few spots to help break it up so you don't notice that it was put on with a roller. So if we look at this concrete that's actually just outside the scene shop garage door, you can see it has this subtle texture, but there's also like a directionality to it. You can see the direction that the workers use their trowel to drag it smooth. So I'm gonna try to replicate a little bit of that in what I've just done. Along this side, I'm gonna take another clean chip brush. I'm just gonna very carefully and gently, and keeping the line as straight as possible. It would be nice if I had taped this, but I didn't. I'm just gonna drag this through very gently so that there will still be texture, but there'll be a little bit of a directionality to it. And I'll just do it on the last couple inches here so you can see the difference afterward. My spackle texture was drying pretty rapidly, so you can see that the brush sort of skips over regions that have started to harden. So on the left side, I let the texture remain pretty rough, and on the right, I dragged over it with a brush. I'm gonna let it dry like this. And then when we paint it, we'll paint it with the same exact paint treatment, but you'll be able to see how that treatment looks on two different textured surfaces. This is drying pretty fast, so I'm gonna go ahead and pull the tape and wash my brushes before I end up with a bunch of solid material. In this section, I'm going to apply the same material, same spackling paste, but I'm going to apply it pretty heavily with the brush, and then I'm going to use a putty knife to sort of influence the direction of how it lays, and it'll have some depth, but it'll look kind of plastery. Ideally, I would have a wider putty knife than this, but this will do. Just means it'll take me a little bit more time to get it right. And I think that given how fast things actually are drying, I'm going to dip this sponge in this bucket of water and just dampen the surface a little bit. It'll discourage things from drying too quickly on me while I'm working here. And I will have to work kind of quickly because this is gonna smooth out best while it's still quite damp. So I'm really glopping this on, really random. And I'm not going for full coverage. I'm just trying to get it kind of sporadically all over the place. Like, I always call this evenly random. Where you don't want any one area looking too much heavier than the rest, but you don't want it to be perfect. Nature isn't perfect. And this ends up using quite a bit of material. I've got another container of this if we run out, so it's not a problem. So right now it's just glopped on there, real messy. It doesn't matter too much. Tried to achieve some random shapes. And now, using the putty knife, I'm going to start influencing how it lays, so dragging it in different directions. So again, easier to do with a wider putty knife because I'm going to end up with some more sort of obvious putty knife drags here. For best results, I'd recommend using a putty knife with a blade that's 3 or 4 inches wide. And one thing I can do to defeat some of these lines that the putty knife creates is I can go back through it again with the brush and tap a bit to break it up, which I will probably do in a moment here. And the goal here is not to flatten it out completely. Like, you definitely want there to be variations in how thick this appears to be. Even better if you can make it look like there's layers overlapping each other. So I'm gonna take a clean brush now, and I'm gonna go back into some of these areas where I've got some real obvious things happening and just add the tiniest bit of texture to break it up. Another way to smooth this out would be to spritz it with some water. I did buy a sprayer, so I could pull that out and give it a try if this isn't looking like I like it, but I think this is gonna be an interesting texture. This is also one of those kind of textures that honestly, it will look like crap until you get the paint treatment on it, and then it looks amazing because whatever dirty wash you use will settle into all the crevices and give it so much more depth. Once this dries, I may opt to do a second pass over it to give it more depth. We'll see how much this shrinks while it's drying. So I am going to work on this region of this second board. This area is actually going to be for wood graining. You know, sometimes if you're trying to fake a surface as looking like wood, you can pull it off with just paint. But if you want to look really old, maybe it looks like, you know, when wood gets old and weathered, the grain gets raised and you get these highs and lows. And we can fake that with some of this material. So this is a wood graining tool. We've got a few of these kicking around. And I will talk more about this when we get to the paint treatment portion. But this is going to help me create the illusion of a raised wood grain texture. So again, I'm making certain this board is damp. Just knock the brush off the table. I'm making certain that this board is damp so that it doesn't dry too fast on me. And this time around, I kind of do want to put on a relatively thin, even layer. So I'm going to try to brush this on pretty quickly. And it's okay for there to be brush strokes because we are trying to create a wood grain effect anyway. So if I just keep the brush strokes pretty vertical up and down on the board, and then I'll do the graining in that direction too. I mean, even doing this alone with a textured medium to give it a direction before you paint it can help with this sort of illusion of a textured and aged wood. And I'm going to use the wood graining tool. Now, just like I would do with paint, which I'll demonstrate later on when I'm doing paint treatment on these other two portions here, the wood graining tool basically has a bunch of ridges on it, which don't look very natural when you look at the piece, at the tool. But the goal is to rock this through the material, and it will catch on these different layers and create elongated, well, it's hard to describe. I'll just show you. So. I'm wearing my paint shorts today. I have a very bad habit of using my pants as a towel. Woo! That's not what I wanted. So now I'm going to use just the little nubby ends to drag through this some more. And I'm not trying to replicate any particular species of wood right now. You can get really specific. You can buy these graining tools with like different sized ridges. Sometimes they can be squiggly. This is a pretty good, just generic tool here. I use a brush sparingly to break up or soften any ridges that look too strong or too regular. So it's not very thick. It's going to dry pretty flat, so it probably won't have a huge effect. But I did want to show you the difference between a wood grain that's purely paint and a wood grain that has a little texture built up underneath. This area is a little bit solid, so I'm just going to make a little knot hole for myself. So I'm going to let these textures dry. I'm going to clean up these brushes I've used. We'll come back a little bit later and take a look to see whether I want to add any more to these before I paint them. I suspect I might want to do a little bit more on this one. So I want to be able to show you a few different types of wood graining effects. One of them obviously is going to be that sort of weathered textured wood. I'm going to do one that is sort of fully painted using the wood graining tool with a combination of some brush strokes in there as well. And then I want to do one using the wood graining tool using actual wood stain directly on the natural color of the masonite. It'll look very dark, but it's a way of doing a very, very quick effect if that color is suitable for what you're doing on stage. We've got some red mahogany, English chestnut. I don't know, I think this dark walnut might be the best bet that I've got right here. Never mind, this is oil-based and I'm not using that. So we will be choosing a water-based stain. So we're going to pretend that we have water-based stain by taking some water-based polyurethane and mixing some pigments into it. And we'll just use it like it's a stain. We're doing a pretty quick process, so it shouldn't really matter too much. A little bit of that in there. It's more than I need. Polyurethane is meant to be a sealer, but it works pretty good as just a medium if you're trying to mix other things into a glaze, or if you want to have tinted sealers, it's a pretty good product. Polyacrylic also works pretty well that way. Charcoal. I think you'd be surprised how much dark pigment it actually takes to overcome the white tintable base in a lot of paints. If you start with too much white in your mix to start with, you might end up with a whole 5-gallon bucket of pastel paint and still not quite to the degree that you want it to be darkened. It's pretty frustrating. If I was doing this sample to show to a designer as an option and I wanted to be able to replicate it, obviously I'd be far more scientific about how I'm mixing these colors. Oftentimes when you make these sample boards, you want to document everything, what colors you're using, the proportions of the colors, whether you've added any other like clear flat or sealer or water to the mix, texture mediums. When you're working with latex paints, like house paints, as you know, that works just fine, and a lot of theaters do it. It's easy to like pick a color from a color chip and go have it made, and you can usually get things in flat colors, and it's easy to work with, it's washable. But they tend not to look the same wet as they do dry. They tend to darken or lighten significantly. So I'm gonna guess that this is gonna come out darker than it looks. So I'm gonna make a little sample and dry it with a hairdryer so we can see how dark it really is. Just to illustrate the difference between how color looks wet versus dry, this is a patch that I speed dried using a hairdryer just to see how dark it would dry. And then now I'm gonna paint right next to it with the original wet color. Same paint, very different looking wet versus dry. Not my favorite color, but it's gonna work for the purposes of this test. So for our wood graining, I want to start with a couple of lighter tones that'll make up the base color, and then a darker tone that will be used for the graining itself. Turns out I completely failed to record that, but Um, what I've got here is I've got a gentle wet blend happening with these two tones I've selected for my base color. There's this sort of medium brown color and this very, very light cream, yellowish cream tone. Essentially, I was working with both colors simultaneously, dipping in as needed. I wanted it to be mostly of the medium tone with some of this light coming through. So I'll just demonstrate on top of what I've done. So here's me adding in a little bit more of the dark tone again. I'm going to dip into this light color and kind of reinforce this lighter region I've got coming across here. Even if this variation doesn't end up being super noticeable in the end, it will help it look more, well, it'll look less lifeless. But once it's had a chance to dry, I'm going to come back and we'll do the wood graining with the darker tone on top of this. So I am going to go ahead and add another layer of texture on this just to give it more depth. I'm happy with how it's looking in general, but I want to have some more extreme highs and lows. So let's just dig right in here. So I'm going to glop some of this texture over places where I've already been. Over here in concrete land, you can see it has dried, but I think you can probably tell that the peaks are much less pronounced than when I first applied it. So it did shrink a fair amount. But I'm not gonna worry about it because I think it's gonna still do the effect I want. We've got one side that has sort of a directionality dragged through it, and another side that's just rough. Our textured wood grain from before also has dried. You can see it's very subtle. Those ridges are pretty shallow. So I'm gonna go ahead and apply a base color to this, but I'm gonna thin it with some water so we don't end up filling in too many of those cracks. I'm gonna keep the base color for the weathered wood very light because you probably noticed that as wood ages and gets sun bleached and beat by the elements, it gets lighter and grayer over time. And because I'm coming back to gray things out, I'm actually not going to be concerned about these little bits of their natural masonite color you see coming through. That's actually going to help us out. So I've mixed up a medium gray color that I'm going to use to coat this entire board. So I'm going to go over my concrete texture, over this blank space in the middle where I'll do a different treatment later, and over our sort of like plastery, goopy texture, which technically if you touch it, I can tell it's still damp on the inside, but the surface is dry enough that as long as I'm gentle with the brush, I can paint over it. This paint actually has some primer mixed into it, so it should have pretty good coverage. So I'll go ahead and do a little time lapse of me coating this thing and we'll let it dry for a while. So previously, I used a very watered down version of this color of paint to go over this aged texture area. So before I do any more washes, that's already starting to look old just because you see some of this grayness coming through from the original color of the masonite. I'm gonna do a little bit of dry brushing of the original full strength color in a few places just to make certain that the high points are highlighted pretty well. Dry brushing, the goal is to have very, very little paint on your brush and to touch the surface you're working with very gently. So you're just hitting the high points with the paint. You're not letting it settle into the cracks. So I don't have a lot of paint on here. And I'm gonna aim for some of these sort of like more pronounced grain pieces. Holding it mostly flat. Very gentle touch. You can sort of see how these raised portions of the texture get highlighted, but I'm not filling in all the space. We're gonna work on this section, which I did the base for this twice because I was about to wood grain it, and then I tore up the base color because I didn't wait long enough. I was too impatient. But this time around, I've taken the paint and I've thinned it a bit with some matte urethane so it's more glazy. Somebody here has already done this. They've taken a chip brush and they've trimmed it so that it has a sporadic sort of staggered brush edge. And I'm going to use this to basically dry brush some graining on one side over here, and then I'm going to come back through and add some actual graining with the graining tool. So it'll be a combination of brush grain and dragged grain. And the trick with the brush grain is always the starting and the stopping. Like, once you get the brush moving, it usually looks pretty good, but you have the risk of having like a heavy glob at the beginning or at the end. So you kind of want to have really gentle pressure as you start and then bring it in heavier. Many times from 30 or 40 feet away, you can get away with this, throw a glaze over the top to tie it all together, and it's sufficient for wood grain on stage. But we're gonna leave that portion alone just so you can see the difference when everything is done. And in the spot beside it, I'm gonna do the graining with the actual graining tool. I'm gonna paint this on pretty solidly and then scrape it away. And hopefully this time, I didn't do it wrong. Hopefully I gave it enough time to dry this time that it will behave itself. You have to work quickly with this technique. That paint starts to dry the moment it touches the surface, so you have to carefully assess how large an area you can cover and grain within a span of minutes. As I drag the tool across the surface, I'm applying even, firm pressure and slowly rocking it forward and back to control the shape of the painted wood grain. That's still left a pretty big dead zone right here, but I don't really want to try to go back into it. Although I will use one of the edges here to come into this zone a little bit. That's better. I like that. So on the right-hand side, that's the very sort of subtle dry brushed grain. On the left is the graining done with the actual graining tool. And there could be one or two steps after this. In this case, I'm gonna let this dry, and I'm just gonna choose a final sealer, probably a tinted sealer to help tie it all together. It'll look like pretty decent wood for stage. So here's my darker brown that I mixed. It has some charcoal gray in it to make it a little darker so it'll show up better on this natural masonite color. I blocked this off because I want to do different grain directions. So I'm going to do a piece with the grain running this way. I'm going to do the same thing down here, and then after that dries, I'll retape it and I'll have grain running the other direction. So we'll end up with sort of a, not quite a checkerboard, but a similar effect happening here. It might just turn out to be garbage, but so I'm painting this on directly to the masonite. no priming, no sealing. This stain style graining works much better on a lighter colored substrate like MDF, which typically has a beige wood-like tone to begin with. It's awfully dark. I don't think that it is very successful. It would be fine for a very, very subtle, very dark grain, like maybe on a piece of furniture. But I think what I'll do is this other strip here, I'm gonna come seal this with some sealer first so it doesn't take so much of the dark pigment so quickly. So this is straight matte polyurethane. We're just gonna seal this section. And of course, sealing it does make it darker to begin with, but it will help it resist some of the fake stain we're using over the top. I have a suspicion we'll have a very similar outcome, but it's worth trying. So something worth noting when you're dealing with painter's tape, even though this tape is meant to be very gentle on surfaces and come off easy, like a temporary hold, if you get just the right light on this masonite, you can see here that the tape I had here earlier when I was painting this portion actually ripped up some of the tempered surface just enough that you can perceive a difference in the surface quality. Viewed straight on, it won't be a problem, but you know, if this were a side light show, hypothetical show that I was painting for, that could be a real problem. So let's see what difference we get, if any, from sealing that first. If nothing else, I did notice that the action of the graining tool was much smoother over the sealed masonite. But the added step of pre-sealing pretty much defeats the purpose of stain graining. It's not a huge difference. It's definitely more contrast between the sealed background color and the graining. We'll pass judgment on it when it's actually sealed. It's pretty ugly right now. I'm going to return to this piece here, the aged weathered wood. I'm actually going to make use of the gray I mixed for this stone slash concrete slash plaster. I thinned it with a crap load of water, so it's mostly water. And I've got a rag handy, so if I put too much on, I can wipe it off. But I'm basically just going to wash over this entire sort of aged area with the intent to let this kind of gray color stain and settle into the crevices, make it look older, more weathered, and it'll kill some of this yellowness you see. Awesome, exactly what I wanted. And you can see the high points where I highlighted it are still kind of resisting. I like that. I'm gonna do it one more time, give it one more pass. Hopefully we'll get a little higher contrast again. This time I'm not gonna wipe any of it away. I think I'm gonna let it be darker. I'll let that dry the rest of the way on its own, just so I'm not pushing the pigment around too much. And I'm not actually gonna seal this one because I want it to stay pretty matte and looking like it's been weathered. So I do have one more thing I wanna do to it though. I wanna show you guys a little bit of block aging. So let's move on to our plaster and concrete for a moment, and we'll come back to this. Once again, I failed to capture this process on camera, but here I prepared a light gray and dry brushed it over my textured concrete and plaster samples. as well as lightly cross-hatching some of the same color into the flat center region. So I'm just going to go ahead and try putting a satin sealer on this center portion. And then we'll do a tinted sealer on this, and no sealer here, but I'll do some block aging. We'll leave that alone. We'll see how it dries. If it feels like it could use another shade or two darker, we can either do more coats of the same sealer or we can make a little darker tone. Block aging is a really useful technique for distressing surfaces, making them look like they have layers of paint, making them look like they've been worn without it being obviously put on by a brush. You want to make certain that it's a piece of wood that's relatively flat. So if it's a very cupped piece of wood, that won't help you. You're just going to have a high center or a spot where things don't lay down. But rather than applying paint to the surface using the brush, I'm going to put paint on the block and then use the block to skim over just the high points on our aged wood, the very, very weathered wood. Let's pretend that that's part of a door that used to be painted a teal green blue color, okay? But most of the paint has flaked off. So I'm going to use block aging to bring in hints of that color, and then I'll show you, you'll see. All right, I'm going to do some block aging, mostly sort of in this corner and along this edge. And then I might even paint some of this solid so it looks like it's breaking up into the piece. I've got a smaller brush I'm going to use just to paint the color onto the block. And you can just kind of glop it on. You want it to be a little bit thick and randomized. You don't want it so it's dripping off because you want control, but you want there to be enough paint there that it'll come off when you block age. So now I'm going to basically drag this across the surface, keeping it nice and flat. For a more pronounced effect, I could have added a thickening agent to my teal paint. I could have even used some of the joint compound that I was using earlier to give it more body, so it would have built up thicker on the surface. I also appreciate cleanup for block aging. So this is just a manual pump sprayer that I filled with a very watered down mixture of a dark gray with a little bit of that like yellowy brown mixed in to make it dingy. I'm going to use this to spritz over our entire sample of concrete and plaster and stone looking surfaces. And it's just going to leave sort of a pebbled surface where it's visible, or it's going to settle into the cracks and give us more depth. So I'll play around with this a bit. We'll see how far I take it. I've got it on sort of a medium droplet size right now. This we can't really speed dry with the hairdryer. We have to let this sit flat and dry on its own. But you can see, especially over here in the concrete portion, where the sprayed mixture with water and gray has really settled into the crevices, and you can see those high points much more clearly. This will probably dry pretty dark, so this will be pretty high contrast over here. And then in the middle, we just have sort of a general darkening. I'm going to use a sponge to lift off just a little bit of this in the middle so it doesn't turn out so evenly spritzed. Ideally, this would be a natural sea sponge, but I don't have one right now. I'll just fold this thing up. So there's not much else we can do to that tonight. We're going to have to leave that alone and come back in the morning and take a look at it. I was quite happy with my concrete samples. Not too bad for a cheap texture and 3 shades of gray, and some accidental yellowing from a sponge. No primer, no sealer, apart from a small amount that was in the spray I applied the previous night. Spackle is great for a quick drying texture on surfaces that will be lightly handled. I'm showing you the sample both vertically and horizontally because the appearance of color and texture is heavily impacted by the angle of any illumination. Colors that look dark on a wall will always look a little lighter on the floor. My failed stain graining sample is an eyesore, but I was delighted with my textured weathered wood sample. If you can get the textured graining just right, the paint processes that come after are extremely easy. My combination sample using brush grain alongside a graining tool is a very simple method that looks great at a distance on stage. 2 base colors applied simultaneously, 1 graining color, and a tinted sealer. Before we wrap up, I do want to share updates on construction of our new rehearsal hall. We're starting to see some wall framing go up. It's very exciting. So enjoy these photos before I say goodbye.
There's no business like show business like no business I know. Everything about it is appealing. Everything the traffic will allow. Nowhere could you have that happy feeling when you are stealing that extra bow. There's no people like show. People they smile when they are low. Yesterday they told you you would not go far. That night you won't, and there you are. Next day on your dressing room they hung a star. Let's go on with the show. The costumes, the scenery, the makeup, the props, the audience that lifts you when you're down. The headaches, the heartaches, the backaches, the flops, the sheriff who escorts you out of town. The opening when your heart beats like a drum. The closing when the customers won't come. There's no business like show business like no business I know. You word before the show has started about your favorite old died and gone. Tom and your mom and pa have parted. You're broken hearted, but you go on. There's no people like show.
Thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed this very small peek into the world of scenic painting. Behind the Scenes with Kristen Knudsen is part of our larger series, Digital Clock. Digital Clock is made possible by a generous gift from Phil and Liz Gross. If you want to learn more about our programming or how you can become a supporter, please visit us at collegelightoperacompany.com. As always, join me again this time next week for more demonstrations and updates on ongoing projects at the Highfield Theater and on our campus. Have a lovely day.